My name is Uta Steiger. I'm Deputy Director of the European Institute, and I'm here just to say a very brief few words before we get started. We've been organising this event tonight with the LSE Catalan Observatory, and in some ways it's been a while in the making. We first had discussions about this last year, just in the context or the run-up to a more political event that we did with the Public Diplomacy Council of Catalonia on self-determination processes in the EU, on Scotland and Catalonia at the same time. Our idea then as now really was to offer a second, more humanities-based approach to the topics and questions at stake. One that would really seek to analyse the way nationalist movements, nationalism generally, needs to be perforce understood within a historical context, but also to the extent to which the writing of this history at times can also be not unproblematically be involved or bound up in the process it seeks to describe. Nicola Miller is a professor of Latin American history here at UCL. She's interested in intellectual, cultural and international history and the intersection between the three of them. Paul Preston is the Príncipe de Asturias Professor of Contemporary Spanish History at the LSE and Director of the LSE Catalan Observatory. He'll be very well known to pretty much everybody working on contemporary Spain, 20th century history of Spain. And finally, our guest from Barcelona, Enrico Zelaida Gal, is Emeritus Professor of Contemporary History at the University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, and has published widely on European, Spanish and Catalan nationalism, and generally political and intellectual history of the 20th century. He's also well known, I think, to many Catalan historians because he was the director of the journal L'Avens Revista de Historia, which is well known there.
I think it's fair to say that across the historical profession, nationalism became a significant topic in the 1980s. There were, of course, important earlier works, but they did not really spark wider interest or follow-up research. So in the 1980s, you get two key books from the Marxist tradition. Famously, of course, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism from 1983, and Eric Hobsbawm's Nations and Nationalism Since 1780, Programme, Myth, Reality. I give the full subtitles because I think, in a sense, they give a flavour of the kind of debates they were trying to address. Then there was the classic essay from Ernest Gellner entitled simply Nations and Nationalism, also 1983. Gellner, not of course a historian, but he was making a historical argument. And then also in 1982 there was John Bray's Nationalism and the State, which regrettably has been somewhat overshadowed, I think, by Anderson, Hobsbawm and Gellner. Anyway, you get this constellation of books with varying emphases, but the main thing that they had in common was that they all challenged what is now known across the social sciences as well as in history as methodological nationalism, i.e. uncritically adopting the nation-state as the framework of analysis, basically accepting the arguments of at least some nationalists that nations are natural forms of socio-political organisation. And historians are perhaps particularly prone to methodological nationalism because the formation of the historical profession coincided in the 19th century with the rise of demand for national or nationalist histories, resulting in the problems identified in the publicity for this event. The conflation of national history with nationalism or nationalistic history, especially state-led varieties, and conversely, the displacement of the history of nationalism by national history. It was perhaps Anderson who made the most audacious move in historicising nationalism. By highlighting, perhaps many people would say exaggerating, its inventiveness, its imagined character, he cut a clean swathe through narratives of exceptionalism and progress with their attendant teleology and assumptions of bounded uniqueness. And since these debates of the 1980s, I think it's fair to say that historians have contributed substantially to the understanding of nationalism, not least by showing the variety of institutional arrangements and ideological positions that go by the name of nationalism, thereby highlighting the limitations not only of the archetypal one nation, one culture model, but also of more sophisticated typologies such as civic versus ethnic nationalism, to cite a very well-known one. So, for example, you get a range of types of nationalism being identified. Jürgen Ostenhammel wrote, for example, about global nations formed by migration, deploying nationhood and citizenship as means of integrating people into new communities. There were diasporic nationalisms, there were post-colonial nationalisms, and also versions of nationalism in my own area of study, Latin America, where at the moment of independence in the early 19th century, none of the usually accepted defining features applied. There was no distinguishing language, ethnicity, religion, even culture within the territories that eventually became the nations in Latin America. So all these different nationalisms tend to promote the idea of a national bond, but they don't always have the political program or the culture or ideology of superiority characteristic of at least some European nationalisms. Moreover, the idea of nation has been shown to encompass a variety of possible political units, not only the nation state. Since the 1980s, historians have also worked extensively to reflect critically upon their own historical role in nationalism. I'm thinking here mainly of Stefan Berger's vast research project on the importance of national history writing in the development of nationalisms in Europe. But there are similar accounts for nations, certainly I know of them in Latin America, and I'm sure for other parts of the world too. So historians have contributed to the study of nationalism, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, across the profession, there have been various challenges to methodological nationalism. So these have implications for the whole way that we think about history. It is, I think, just before I go on to those, worth noting that even though the rise of professional history was closely related to the demand for national history in the 19th century, there have long been countervailing tendencies that have created a diverse intellectual inheritance of many ways of thinking about the past, unconstrained by national or nationalist frameworks. In a sense, the revolt against methodological nationalism is not new, although it may be more explicit in our own time. So you've got Marx and his successors, Weber, Burckhardt, the Annals, structuralism, world history, and quite a lot of historical research from within the field of area studies. But transnational history is the latest and perhaps the most explicit in its commitment to decentering the nation state, while also trying to give due recognition to the importance of states of varying types as key sorting houses for networks of connection and practices of exchange. Transnational history has sought to challenge nationalist narratives and their stereotyping or condemnation of the other, challenging nationalist portrayals of other countries as economic or intellectual colonies of Europe, denying them agency, constraining their histories within a restrictive framework of imperialism and resistance. And some or all of those questions have also been addressed, of course, in the new imperial history, in post-colonial history, Atlantic history, and global history. I'm sure there are others. These different subfields tend to have regrettably little connection with each other, but together they have created a formidable body of work showing how liberating it can be to think outside the box of the nation state. It is important to bear in mind that this shift in perspective away from the unit of the nation state does not in and of itself guarantee that the dangers of teleology or boundedness or ideological agendas associated with methodological nationalism are necessarily avoided. Other units of analysis, of course, Atlantic history, the history of Europe, the history of Latin America, they all run the risk of similar teleological and or ideological determinants. Transnational and global history have both been criticised for legitimating or promoting globalisation or focusing only on its supposedly progressive aspects. There's also the danger of fetishizing fluidity, can't say it, movements, exchanges and transfers, and overlooking inequalities of power and resources, which is why some transnational historians argue that their approach is best carried out with the check of comparative analysis. Despite these caveats, however, I think it's fair to say that the debates generated by both global history and transnational history have stimulated greater self-consciousness and reflexivity, and a stronger sense like the past, like the present, will always escape the intellectual containers we create to give us the necessary illusion of being able to interpret it. I would say now that the difficulties historians face in escaping the nationalist framework are less intellectual than institutional. The historical profession in most European countries and the United States is still predominantly organised along national or nationalist lines. In universities, where the policies of national governments tend to penetrate ever more intrusively, in research funding, in learned societies, in the organisation of archives. And there are some encouraging initiatives to break this down, beyond the international networks that individuals have always created for themselves. So you've got ERC funding, for example, and you've got centres of global or transnational history, such as our one at UCL. But still, there are very few dedicated doctoral programmes, and these centres are often not very well funded, so their impact is limited by that. It is also, I think, a challenge for historians to make transnational history appealing to an audience beyond the academy. We can return to that perhaps in discussion.
This was the original theme that I was asked to discuss. By tripping here on the wires, I should add that I got so nervous I didn't even thank Uta Steiger for inviting me and thanking the European Studies Center of the UCL for allowing me to be here. I repeat, basically two subjects. One is history and nationalism, the other is Spain and Catalonia in a comparative context. I took one classic, very influential novel, has a huge impact, for example, on the development of racism, which is Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, and a map of Spain with Catalonia highlighted. Barcelona, so I'm going to talk about the two things and try and do it very quickly, 15 minutes. I've lived in Barcelona for 42 years. I'm 66 years old. I was born in New York. Therefore, I'm not a Catalan. I've taught 35 some years in Catalan, but I, like Paul Preston, speak Catalan, but I'm not a Catalan. So there's just the fact that I've described presents questions of conflict and confusion. I found this image particularly fascinating because if 42 years ago I had said to my newfound Catalan friends that some 30-some years later, where the mosque was going to be located in Catalan towns would be a subject of considerable political debate and often bitter confrontation, I would have literally been taken to a booby hatch, a nut house. I would have been given Thorazine and told to calm down. So time changes things considerably. This image is an image by Muslim Catalans of wanting to participate. The idea of Muslim Catalans being independentist is seen in a historical perspective from 1972, when I first, when I was first in Barcelona, or when I first began to do the research on my doctoral dissertation and ended up staying there, would have been unimaginable. Catalanism as a movement is something extraordinarily vague. It is the traditional way that Catalan nationalists and non-nationalists have referred to the national movement. But it is a patriotism, it's latitudinarian, it centers on the idea that love of Catalonia can overcome anything from mild home rule to strongly pro-independent sentiment. This movement begins in 1886. One can trace antecedents from 1882 with the word, but specifically this book creates that concept, that reading of the term, and it lasts until 2012. In 2012, the mass demonstrations change everything and require a specificity, a definition, a presence of pro-independence sentiment that is generally polled at somewhere between 30 and 40% of those who would consider themselves nationalists in one way or another. This, for 126 years, was unimaginable. It was a small movement, easily under 10%, perhaps under even 5%, based on male socialization and bonding until the 1980s. You only begin to get female presence then, and it's an experience to go through. Many young male adolescents, 15 to 28, would go through a radical nationalist experience and then settle down to be nice, normal Catalanists like all their friends and neighbors. So this moment is the moment of change. One can obviously present a more complex representation of this. The cracks really begin to show in 2010, but this day, which is the Catalan national holiday, or the nationalist national holiday, excuse the redundancy, creates, by filling up all of downtown Barcelona, creates the image that it is clear this is the independentist flag, not the Catalan flag. Lone Star. You can guess where that comes from. Straight from Texas. And I'm quite serious. Straight from Texas by way of Cuba, obviously. It's a very difficult position to assume in geopolitical terms. Neither Spain nor France, who is therefore supporting this option against two hostile neighbors. Spanish nationalism arises in Cuba in the Cuban Civil Wars from 1868 through 1898, and it is an import from the Civil War to Spanish politics. This discourse, this is Spain, if you don't like it, leave, I'm saying is very odd. Reminds me of the 1960s in the US, love it or leave it. It's a very curious argument to offer secessionists, because they are, of course, wanting to leave. And it presents a structural confusion, I think, of collective categories and individual categories, which is one of the core problems around which the discussion of nationalism revolves. The reply is evident. Spanish nationalism, or Españolismo, is fascism. But the counter-reply is the same. Catalan nationalism, Catalan independentism, is fascism. Or worse still, Nazism. My two working hypotheses. One is that all national history of any kind, and in this I would be clearly an heir to the 1980s, all national history, even when it's made by historians who think of themselves as non-nationalists, is in some sense national. And second, a strong critical rejection of the misapplication of the term identity with the gratuitous assumptions about its abundance and even relevance in social life, which I will not open that particular can of worms today, but this is where I'm working from. I would add to what Nicola Miller said a second phase, which is that while in intellectual terms, in professional terms, it is in fact the 1980s that clearly present the basis for all ongoing discussion thereafter. It is the collapse of communism between 1989 and 1991 that removes social history, which had been an extraordinarily potent force since the 1960s in historiography, and replaces the debate in social history with the discussion of national history. National history and nationalism, nationalist histories. Second, my argument would be that writing national history is extraordinarily tempting because of the way we write and because of the limits that our mind has. I used a quill pen as an example of writing, but in fact, all the other instruments here I have used. I'm that old. I started out with a fountain pen, had to type, or had my wife type, with happy sexism, my dissertations. The ballpoint is an invention effectively of the 1940s, and you don't get personal computers until the mid-1980s. And obviously internet starts in 1994. So there's an ongoing change behind all of this. And nevertheless, I think that writing, the nature of writing, how one writes, how one defines the subject, and what readers one is aiming at, whether one is aiming at 17 academic readers, maybe the 17 who count, but they are only 17, or whether one is aiming at a very broad, large audience of interested people who are not necessarily specialists in history. This all plays on the nature, on the very elusive scientific nature of history production. You try and find a narrative sequence to the complexity of multiple interactions in time-space. One possibility which does not easily exist in prose. And you can create a narrative sequence. Here's one by Elliot Erwitt, who is just following a beach umbrella. You can think about the kinds of angles, shifts of focus, ways of looking at things from different angles. This is a study of movie storyboards that Saul Bass, with the cover illustrations are by Saul Bass for Hitchcock's Psycho. You can create, it's a simple one-line narrative. It's going one way. But you are seeing it from a whole variety of viewpoints. This is extremely difficult to do in prose, as those of us who have tried to do it for numerous years all know well. Because national history is not only easy to read, it's like biography. Biography is the easiest historical genre. You automatically know, as a reader, what is going to happen in a biography. The protagonist will be born, he or she will grow up, he or she will have relationships or won't, he or she will have conflicts or won't, will come to some kind of adulthood, grow old, and die. There's a kind of Gauss curve that works for biography, makes biography writing, which is a very strong British tradition, I should add, and a very weak Spanish one, very easy. But therefore, it's very easy to personalize a nation and create tunnel vision. You don't have those easy possibilities of alternative viewpoints. And there is no contemporaneity. This is what Nicola Miller was talking about with currents in terms of either comparative history or global history or transnational history. National biographies, therefore, in this 19th century way, easily lead to typologies and to narrative sequences which are easy to follow. This is your standard history of Spain, history of France, history of Germany, etc. We get to exceptionalism, which, despite its discredit among, I would say rather, left-wing historians, is, in a context like Catalonia, absolutely alive in the university. And so is Spanish exceptionalism. This is posters from the first Spanish Spain is different campaign after Fraga becomes Information and Tourism Minister in 1962. One can endow any territory with character, with personality. Some Països Catalans or Catalonia, or, as appeared in a book that I showed, a book cover, just call it all Catalonia. So there is ongoing, not disappeared, a living 19th century debate, which is between Großdeutschland, Klein-Deutschland, between Großkatalonien and Klein-Katalonien. It's a naturally politicized subject. Now it turns out I've discovered white hats and black hats refers to the kind of hackers there are. But for the first 90 movies that John Wayne made in the 1930s, the good guys all wore white hats. The bad guys all wore black hats just to make it easier to follow the action. And there's a sort of natural tendency within the tunnel to create the two alignments. It makes everything understandable, easy to follow. It creates an easy prose narrative sequence. This, of course, is confronted by the problem or the contradictions of partisanship. What viewpoint do you take? This is why I'm saying that I'm not sure that you can create any kind of history without assuming some standpoint, some viewpoint, the way that you're looking. Take one very easy, the only Spanish quote-unquote philosopher of any merit in the 20th century is Ortega y Gasset. His main idea is that all of you and I are sharing the same room, but we're seeing and will retain the memory of two different rooms. I will see a room full of rows of people. You will see a room with a board or a panel. And same room, different viewpoints. So you can do a Polish history of the Ukraine, you can do a Russian history of the Ukraine, as anybody who's watched TV or read newspapers for the last year knows well. You can do a German history of the Ukraine, and you can do a Ukrainian history of the Ukraine. You can even do a Western Ukrainian history of the Ukraine, and an Eastern Ukrainian history of the Ukraine, and none of them will be the same. And to this is added the demand for authenticity. Nationalists want all things to be authentic. This is one of the big 19th century themes that goes into the 20th century. But then historians are expected to do authentic work, not make it all up as they go along. I put Cuernavaca here because when I was 3, I was in Cuernavaca. I remember it very well, even though it was a long time ago. And I looked it up the other day for something else, and I found that in English it was being called Guajanahuac, and not Cuernavaca. That is to say, it was being put in Nahuatl. One of my graduate students, who is also a good friend, I pointed this out to him. He is ethnically Nahua and speaks, as he puts it, one of the 24 varieties of Nahuatl, and he laughed himself silly. This is perhaps one of the easiest classic examples in European history of a place that it presents us with the problem of what is authentic in time-space. Is this space Vilnius, which is its name now, Lithuanian? Is it Vilno, Vilna, Polish, Ukrainian? What way are you going to understand this space? And the difficulty of trying to create a multiple narrative that will be readable, that will create descriptive prose that can be followed with relative ease, that does not require vast amounts of previous knowledge. We are professionally demanded to have a great deal of factual accuracy and to have enormous, and we measure factual accuracy by very long footnotes. This is T.S. Eliot justifying The Wasteland. I'm not sure that all these footnotes help us to either evaluate or understand the impact of the poem. And then, since I thought if I presented you with a host of Catalans, most of you would be simply nonplussed, I decided to pick something as obvious as 100 years since the 28th of June and the 28th of July and the beginning of World War I. Franz Joseph I loathes his nephew, Franz Ferdinand. And he loathes his nephew especially because his nephew has had the incredible bad taste to fall in love with and insist on a love match with a lesser aristocrat. She has a title, Sophie Chotek, but she's been a lady in waiting, which in a court situation and by Habsburg standards is disgusting. Montenuovo hates Franz Ferdinand. He encourages Franz Josef to dislike him, but why does this man go so far out of his way so that Franz Ferdinand decides to accept, he has the job of superintendent of the Austro-Hungarian armed forces, why go to oversee army maneuvers in Bosnia? Because he there is in command and Montenuovo can do nothing about it, and his wife will be given same rank treatment as his own. And this is the first time he can obtain this. So he decides to go to Bosnia so that he can have a holiday with his wife. This is why I decided to come to London, by the way, but that's not important. Montenuovo, obviously, Gavrilo Princip, was 17 years old, does his job, and even though she's been created Duchess of Hohenberg, she gets shot first, and they both die. Montenuovo does his worst. He, even after death, tells all the courts of Europe who are beginning to pack not to come, they're not wanted, and then puts it out that this is a very trivial event because no royal member of any royal family has come. Why is this man so obsessed? Well, because he comes from a bastard dynasty. Worse, from an adulterous bastard family. He's the grandson of Marie-Louise of Austria. Look at me. An enormous amount of reading silly biographies to discover this fact. And Marie-Louise, while Napoleon is still alive, is still married to Napoleon. It's a Catholic marriage. But she has, by her general help, Count Neipperg, a child. And this child will be the father, will be given Montenuovo as invented title. And obviously, Franz Ferdinand, who had very bad temper, must have made some comment about bastards to him at court. And so you have this whole context, pure chance. I won't even go into the whole context of why Gavrilo Princip is there, why he's at that corner of the bridge, about thinking about how to shoot himself when the car backs up incorrectly after going the wrong way. And then all the other effects. Who equips him? Well, in fact, the head of military intelligence, Colonel Dmitrievich. But is Colonel Dmitrievich actually interested in killing Franz Ferdinand, or is he interested in overthrowing the radical government of Nicola Pasic in Serbia? Now, the Serbians are involved, but it's Dmitrievich who is involved, not Nicola Pasic. In the meantime, the Austrian Foreign Office, as in 1908, annexed Serbia. Ehrenthal, foreign minister, who subsequently dies. Berthold holds up this policy, and the Germans are willing to do what the Austrian chief of staff suggests, Konrad von Hötzendorf, because they all think he is a marvelous strategist. In 100 years of history, he's treated as a perfect imbecile. But in German military sources of the time, they all say he's the best strategist there is. Nobody can do a plan like General Conrad. Carried through staff work, we won't discuss that, that's a mess. That's the usual Austrian mess up. But that's one of the reasons why the Germans back him. Okay, how do you make any sense of this? You have all manner of nationalisms and things that are pre-national. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, all together. And how do you create a narrative that makes sense of all of this? And this is obviously just picking out a few people. Now, if you take into account that in 1960, when I was 12 years old, the world celebrated having 3,000 million people. It now has quite a much larger number, estimated at 7.2 billion people. And it is estimated at reaching anywhere from 8 to 9 to more by 2050. Here we have the problem of our present. Between 2006 and 2011, we have a to the 10th power growth in information. Between 2010 and 2020, it's expected to be a to the 50th power growth in terms of online information. Much of this may be rubbish, but it doesn't matter. Much of it isn't. So being a historian is getting very, very difficult. And that's it.
Right, I know not the first thing about any of this, but one or two thoughts have been provoked by what I hear. Now, to start with the end of what Enrique was saying, it occurred to me that usually with most of my students, one of the things I say to them is, this table, I mean not this one, any table, is the history of the world. And from that end to that end is the chronology. So from the cavemen to the present day. And from here, usually I prefer a wider table, but anyway, from this side to this side is the geography of the world. And basically, there are two kinds of historians. There are those who know from that end to that end, and from here to here, to the level of the varnish. And there are those like me who can find a little knot in the wood down that end. And I know that knot down to the cellar. So basically, as a historian, you can either know more and more about less and less, or less and less about more and more. And I'm one of the people who knows more and more about less and less. I've forgotten everything I ever knew about Latin American history, German history, Italian history, Russian history, all the things I used to have to teach when years ago as a professor in Queen Mary, I had to give a course called World History. Now, So actually what I do is I write the history of Spain. And I was rather alarmed when Nicola, or maybe I misunderstood, but I thought maybe she was saying that methodological nationalism kind of implied that if you write, the person who's writing the history of any one nation is somehow writing national history, if not even nationalist history. And I find that very, very difficult. I mean, the case of Spain, for instance, obviously I write about 20th century Spain, and particularly about the Spanish Republic, whose flag I proudly bear, and its defeat in the Spanish Civil War, and the regime that was established thereafter as the institutionalization of the victory of the extreme right in that war. Now, what's odd about that kind of history, or that particular history, is that unlike what we're usually told, it's actually a history written by the losers. I am one of the losers. And in a sense, I could say, although I trust all of you not to repeat this, that my career has been about trying to reverse the result of the Spanish Civil War, which is about as reasonable a task as trying to make the Premiership equal and not all about money. But anyway, we won't go into that for a moment. Now, Enrique said a number of very interesting things with which I agree totally. I mean, for instance, to take his point about how easy it is to write biography. As a biographer, or some of my books are biographies, of course it's easy in the sense that you don't have the structural problem. You don't have the problem, which obviously if you're writing world history you have, of trying to bring all your themes along like an army, because the structure's done for you, basically. It's the chronology of the life. Although, having spent 12 years doing the research for a biography of General Franco, I'm not sure it was that easy. But anyway, Now, the other point he made, one of the other points he made, which I agree with, he said, the task of the historian is to produce a narrative sequence. One hopes a digestible narrative sequence. And then that raises the issue, why, for whom, etc. Now, it seems to me that any historian, exactly like any journalist, whatever, and the journalists, if you like, write the first draft of history, well, not the cavemen ones, but in the modern era, the journalists write the first draft. And it seems to me that any historian or any journalist writes through an ethical prism. There is no such thing as objectivity. The things that matter to the historian or the journalist, no matter how much they try, are going to have an impact on what they write. And if it so happens that the person in question is a ferocious nationalist, then that's going to be the strongest filter, and then that raises all kinds of other issues, which I'll get to. Now, in a way, all I'm saying here is that actually, I honestly don't know what is meant by nationalist history. I mean, I'm not being funny. I genuinely don't understand. If you mean the history of nationalism, in other words, someone sits down and writes a scholarly account of nationalist movements, then that's one thing. If you're talking about people who write history, who write stories, because one thing we've got to remember is that in every language I know anything about, the word for history and the word for story is exactly the same. So it's slightly different in English, but everywhere else, Geschichte, Storia, Histoire, Histoire, and so on and so forth. That, in a way, the people who write, whose, if you like, ethical filter is the nationalist one, is the one about national identity, it is very likely that what they will be doing is not writing history at all, but writing propaganda. I can remember some years ago chairing an event given at the time, an event by Jordi Pujol, at the time the president of Catalonia, and not then regarded as the thieving criminal that he now is regarded as. And throughout this speech, he made the most outrageous claims about Catalonia as the greatest nation on earth, and had done all kinds of things, that the Catalan Empire had extended to Turkey, and so on. And every now and then, and it was an audience of about 5 times more, actually, there were about 500 people in the hall. And every now and then he'd turn and he'd say, "As I'm sure the historian will vouch." And it left me in a very rather difficult ethical position. Here's the great man telling lies, and I'm supposed to be nodding, saying, "Absolutely, that's right." And this is a problem. I was talking to a colleague on the way here about a wonderful set of interviews that I'd listened to by Pau Casals, the great cellist, and a man who I admire beyond measure. And yet, when he was talking about Catalonia, it was in exactly the same terms: the greatest empire there's ever been, the nation that invented democracy, and so on. And that, of course, is nationalism. It's propaganda. It's not history. So, you know, going back to what I do for a living, which is, as I said earlier, writing about 20th century Spain, I don't think that I write about nationalism, although in a sense it's implicit. The Franco regime, which I've written about and do write about, profoundly nationalist in the same way that the Third Reich was profoundly nationalist. One of Franco's books was called Raza, Race. So it was a sort of in a sense, a racial nationalism. Well, that's a long story. The ideology of the regime was actually self-denominated national Catholicism, and so on. But in writing about it, I don't feel that I was writing nationalist history, or indeed the history of nationalism. I was just telling stories, because, going back to what I said before, it's about, you try to tell the truth, which of course is impossible, but you do your best with all the footnotes that Enrique talked about. I don't see there's any problem in trying to write readably. That's not incompatible with footnotes. It is, in my view, incompatible with theoretical gobbledygook, but that's a whole other story. So basically, I don't think that there's any such thing as nationalist history. I think there's good history and bad, and I think that nationalist history is not history, it's propaganda. So I've finished, by the way, in case you hadn't noticed.
But the concern of transnational historians is that if all history is national history, then, well, one, there's dangers of teleology, in the sense that you take the nation as the natural unit. You think in early modern history about how the nation emerges, and you assume that that is a constant and unchanging unit of analysis. And there are also an awful lot of things in developments in the modern world that really can't be understood if you take the main frame as the nation state. So migration, diaspora, slavery, imperialism, a whole load of developments that the nation state is part of. It's part of the history of course, but if you only think about the nation state. So the argument is not to banish the history of nations or the history of nationhood. The argument is to suggest that you also need to think, I suppose in the way that Enrique was talking about, you need to think kind of across structures. You need to think about movements and processes and events that go across the borders, the contingent, historically constructed borders of the nation states. And I think the concern is, you asked what nationalist history would mean. Well, I think the concern is that we can all identify clearly propagandistic nationalist history. That's usually very, very obvious, I think. But what is sometimes harder to pin down is when basically the history of nation building is kind of conflated with nationalism. And that, I think, is the problem that some of us are concerned about. So in a sense, you adopt the assumptions of the nationalists without necessarily being aware that you're doing so. And of course, you're right. There's good history and bad history, and that's what I was trying to say in the sense when I said that there are all sorts of dangers with transnational history and global history, and just adopting that standpoint doesn't necessarily get us out of those kind of problems. It's all about being as aware as we can be of what we're doing with our sources and the questions we're asking. Some of the other points that Enrique raised in his fascinating talk, some of them prompted some thoughts in relation to Latin America, perhaps particularly the point you were making about simultaneity and how you think about that. Because, I mean, one of the key elements of Anderson's argument was the idea of creating a sort of sense of what he called it, or the clumsy phrase, homogeneous empty time, but the idea that there is a kind of sort of flat time in which everybody within a territory can, with which they can identify. And that actually makes all sorts of assumptions, I think, about linearity and in the writing of history as well. Because in various Latin American countries, of course, there are, given the different ethnic groups within Latin American borders, the different histories that those different populations have experienced, then it's very, very difficult to talk about some kind of homogeneous time. And actually, of course, it's overlaid with all sorts of real problems about internal colonialism, coercion, the repression that indigenous peoples have experienced, and all those kind of things. So there are various strategies that have been adopted within Latin American nation states to try to overcome this. But basically, you really can't assume this homogeneous sense of time, uniform time across a territory that Anderson is basically assuming, I think, in his model. So conceptions of time. And he, of course, in the second volume of Imagined Communities did add the chapter, a very important chapter, I think, about space, and the way he was thinking about how nations extend themselves over territories. He was talking about mapping and censuses and museums and all these kind of geographical features of nationalism. But one of the most valuable aspects, I think, of some of the recent thinking about nationalism has been to think much more about space and place and the importance of that. So in a sense, we're kind of perhaps moving away from always thinking about history as the foundation of nationalism. Because in Latin America too, history as the foundation of nationalism was deeply problematic. Because they weren't like the United States. They didn't really have a success story to tell in the late 19th century. So in a way it was a disadvantage, in a way it was an advantage in terms of it gave them a more flexible and open approach to thinking about what nationalism consisted of. And for many in many Latin American nationalisms, the land is a very important part. The land and the landscape is a very important part of the national imagining, and that kind of cuts across some of these conventional points about linear time and history in nationalism. And the other thing I was particularly struck by you were talking about, Enrique, was the point about literary solutions and the role that they play in the way that we try to address some of these problems in the presentation of our research. And I think that's very interesting because, of course, a lot of this transnational, global, comparative history, however you want to characterize it, a lot of it requires demands on people's expertise that mean really you can only do it collaboratively because you need different language competencies, you need different understandings of different places, different archival situations to work in. And so you have to work collaboratively. Then that opens up all sorts of questions about how you reconcile your themes, how you create your narrative, how you actually, the process of writing. But I do think that quite a lot of the books that have come out over the last decade or so at least, there are some very interesting experiments in historical writing. Chris Bailey's Making of the Modern World, I would say, is one that's worth thinking about. Jürgen Osterhammer's monumental tome, but that kind of thematic approach where he is trying, to some extent, to do the diachronic and the synchronic together across an extraordinary range of material, I think. And it's a very impressive piece of work. And there are many others that one could name. So I think there's all sorts of very interesting experiments going on in history, but I agree with you, absolutely, how we actually think through the writing of it is crucial to the whole endeavour.
I think we are storytellers, and I think that a good deal of what makes reading history attractive to most people is storytelling. And so I'm going to tell you 3 stories, followed up by an observation, in part related to what Paul said, and then related to what Nicola said. Paul does a disclaimer, reminded me of the famous story of Palmerston when he was asked about the Schleswig-Holstein question in 1864, leads to the Danish-German War. And he said it was incomprehensible, and only 3 people had ever understood it. One was dead, the other one went mad, and he was the 3rd, and he couldn't remember. It's a famous quote, but it is not, it's germane. There's a problem of narration and retention, which is the second story. A little bit about the ethical prison. The founder of the SNP, and his memoirs, always rued the day, and that's the expression he used, the day he lost unanimity by letting in the second member of the party. So, you know, there is a problem in the other as a writer and the other as a reader. And the problem, and who we're talking to and who we're listening to. And the third story, so that it doesn't sound as if I'm saying that there isn't something here. Nationalism is something cooked up by evil dwarves in some bourgeois hideout. Pau Casals used to earn his money after he studied cello by doing vast tours in strange places. And he toured the western United States in the first decade of the 20th century, Wild West. And he was in Arizona, if I remember correctly, in Tombstone. And like a good Catalan, he decided somewhere around noon to go for a walk. He didn't have to play in the theater until evening. So he goes for a long walk, and he begins to get thirsty and tired, and then he sees a house, and he goes to the house, and asks for some water. The man says, "Oh yes, sure, here's some water." Then asks a very American question, "Where are you from?" And Casals, who manages English in his strong Catalan accent, says, "Well, I come from a faraway country which you have never heard of. It's a country called Catalonia." And the man looks at him and says, "Home, haver-ho dit abans?" Why didn't you say so before in Catalan? There's always a Catalan somewhere. Anywhere, he's there. Just have to find it. Okay, so we have a problem of understanding things. We have a problem of viewpoints that change. And we have a problem that there is a perception that exists. That people who are there, or at least some of the people who are there, feel it and feel a commonness with others. Who they consider to be like them. Now, how do we deal with this? Well, it's very, very difficult. Nicola was talking about simultaneity. I was remembering a study, I don't remember the name of the author right now. It's a fascinating study of Central American elites. Because very carefully and in a very documented way, the author, instead of doing the usual Historia de El Salvador, Historia de Costa Rica, Historia de Nicaragua, etc., simply studied the elites. And it turned out it was the same families in all of those countries, that repeatedly came and went and alternated in power, and intermarried and squabbled. So you have to look outside. But you can't forget that there are also more practical, more solid events Basically, what I was trying to get at, this, as you all know, have been interesting times, which are never a good thing, in Catalonia and in Spain. And I was trying to get at something very, very mundane, but which is my daily bread. If I give a talk in Catalonia, I am expected to stress certain points, and I will be taken roughly, meaning I will be given harsh music, let's say, by my public if I deviate. In fact, I am considered very controversial by most nationalists. But if I go to Madrid, I'm considered a Catalan. And I'm given rough music for being on the wrong side of the issue. To deal with the unit, Spain, is not to deal with its partial units. To deal with the partial units is often to ignore Spain as if it didn't exist. This, as Paul well knows, is the habit of referring to Spain, España, in España, Catalan, as a l'estat español, the Spanish state. And so therefore it is some kind of artificial entity. The problem, very simply, is that Spain exists, so does Catalonia. Or, conversely, Spain doesn't exist, and neither does Catalonia. Both things are true, both things are false. It's very hard for historians to communicate this, to deal with it. It's very hard to write about it. You have immediate problems of language. I have to talk, and Paul, when he's writing about Catalonia, you have to write about comarcas. What is a comarca in English? Has no translation. It's not a county. You use it about, you say county, but no, it's the Count of Barcelona that starts the whole thing going. You have immediate problems of shifting between the language of analytical discourse and whatever it is you are describing. Now let it go here.
In the future, when historians write about the Catalan independence movement, will that be seen as a nationalist movement? I was there 2 weeks ago, and the first thing I was asked about was Scotland's referendum. So I am also half Catalan and half Spanish, so it interests me a great deal to see what's happening in Spain. And as you said, they are two parts of Spain that live symbiotically together. But my feeling about nationalism is that it's always brought division between people that used to live well together. And that's my worry about the independence movement in Catalonia. And I'm a very proud Catalan and speak Catalan and Spanish. So it's for people who don't live there full time. You feel a bit like an English person when they were voting in Scotland, that you kind of feel that you can't that you have no say in the matter, but you watch it with interest from afar. So I'd be interested to see how a historian will write the future of the Catalan independence movement.
How do you think that historical academia has influenced the current independence movement, if it has at all? Say, like how history in the academia, nationalist history or not, has influenced the current independent movement since 2012, if you think it has.
Okay, great. So just one question on the future history of Catalonia and another one on how history writing currently may have influenced independence movement as it is. Do you want to go first? And
I have no idea what the future holds, literally. I mean, I don't even know what will happen during November. The way that younger political scientists are analyzing it, I mean, the dissertations that are being done right now, I think one in particular, the the focus, is on a generational shift. That is to say, people who are under 30 have a new sense of being, what being Catalan means. I'm very sick living in Barcelona of the very cynical use of the word recession among world official elites. Barcelona is a deeply depressed city that is being radically altered before my eyes. In an impoverishing way, in the sense of the old Marxian term of immiseration. And I can give many and very different social examples of this. So I have no idea where this is going, because I don't think it's a party-run movement. I think we're talking about sentiment, and about people whose sentiment has changed, and who are on the street, as opposed to being led by politicians, be they the governmental parties, be they the sometime ally, sometime enemy of the governmental party on the nationalist side, be it the different assembly-oriented movements, or being the Spanish government and its particular way of playing poker with the whole thing by not playing. So I don't know what the future is. What I do know are that current events have altered the discourse, street discourse. The big theme was, until the Crimean annexation, we want to do a plebiscite. And then on the very same day, Merkel and Obama said, you can't do a referendum if it's anti-constitutional. It won't be recognized. If you are for independence, are you willing to fight for it? Do you really want to see everything in ruins so as to be quote-unquote free? As to whether university or historians have altered this significantly, I don't think so. I think that you had a dominant tradition that was very much towards social history and very much about working class history through the 90s. And then this just sort of evaporates. And you begin to do strongly, despite what Paul says, but in the sense of the way that he was talking about the old Jordi Pujol, strongly nationalist history in the sense that you are doing retroactive teleology, meaning you're going as far back as you can to prove that then is as now. And this has had some academic support, but this also has a lot to do with the fact that what in the Spanish system are called associate professors, who are generally doctors who are not accredited as functionaries. You have to be a functionary in the public system. You were being paid 1,000 euros in 2006 for teaching a course for a semester. This last season, this last academic year, you were being paid 300, very best 350. University of Barcelona was offering 185 euros for courses for this academic year. That's one of the reasons why the English and German teachers simply just refused. I mean, they were absolutely understaffed, and then there were student reactions I'm talking about 2 weeks ago, because it's not worth it to correct papers for 100 students, to be paid for 3 months 185 euros. This, of course, affects very deeply the kinds of options that people have. One of the options is go to London.
I just wanted to make a comment in response to the question about what influence or other historians have had. I mean, it's so difficult. I mean, thinking about what Nicola was saying before about all the things that historians should be taking into account. Well, it depends what you're writing about, and you know, I mean, obviously there are almost as many historians as there are bus conductors, so you know, that for starters, that's a problem. The kind of history that Enrique was just referring to, and I mentioned in the event with Jordi Pujol. I mean, obviously there is that kind of history, you know, from the cavemen to the present day. I remember years ago being shocked in a seminar given by a Basque in which he gave an interpretation of Basque, wasn't what he was supposed to be doing, but he gave an interpretation of Basque history, which basically, I'll sum it up for you, you know, that once upon a time in the mists of time, round about the same time as Wotan and Siegfried and so on, these gigantic, blonde-haired, blue-eyed creatures came out of the mist, and they were the Basques. And I mean, obviously, that kind of stuff is utter tripe. And clearly, whatever the Catalan equivalent, which is a bit more sophisticated, I can't. Maybe there are people who believe it, but I don't know. But I do think, I mean, there has been, since the death of Franco and since it's been possible to do more serious historical research, there has been some superb historical writing in Catalonia. And the problem is, we immediately get, when you ask the question, it's like those of you who are academics know about the ludicrous notion that we're all currently judged on what's called impact, which is bad news if you're a professor of Latin grammar, whereas if you're doing research on cure for cancer, you might have a better rating. But anyway, the whole issue about impact of any kind of writing, historical writing, you get into the whole sordid issue of sales. How many books are sold? How many people read those books? So it's very difficult. However, I'll give you two examples of stuff, things out of hundreds of really wonderful bits of historical writing that have come out of Catalonia, and I think must have had an impact, but I can't prove it. One is a book by a monk in the monastery of Montserrat, Hilari Raguer, who wrote a wonderful book called Divendres de Passió, Good Friday. And it was about the persecution of a Catholic Catalan by the Franco regime for the simple reason that he was Catalan. It's a long story, I'm not going to tell you now. That's one. The other is by another Catalan historian called Ricard Vinyes, which is about the treatment of women in Francoist prisons. Now, both of these, anyone who read those could not but feel fury about the Franco regime and the things it did. And so I would assume, and again, we're back to the issue, maybe only 3,000 people read each of them, but that must have had an impact on the reader. It's impossible. In the same way, for instance, I remember when I didn't learn Catalan till very late in life, and of course, as a result of that, it got sort of treated extremely well by the Catalan media. And shortly after I was in Madrid, and a friend, a lifelong friend, who was a socialist, said to me in a really critical voice, "I hear you've been on the TV in Catalonia speaking in Catalan." And I said, "Yeah, what's the problem?" He said, "Well, you're just encouraging them." And that, of course, makes you, I mean, in the case of me, and I'd like to think I'm fairly neutral on all of this, as I said before about the ethical filters, you can't actually be neutral about anything. But that's the kind of thing that made me feel or come a bit nearer to some understanding of Catalan problems vis-a-vis Madrid.
I struggle with methodological approaches as a third-year PhD student, who, amongst other things, is looking at Catalan contributions to medicine during the Spanish Civil War. And I wonder if an emphasis on methodological approaches is misplaced if you have an ability to tell a tale.
Well, I always say, and you heard me say before, I have no truck with methodology. And when I say this in the presence of deeply respected colleagues, they say, oh yeah, you're talking absolute rubbish. What you do is riddled with methodology. And of course, they're right. Except that it seems to me that methodology is something that you can sum up in a very short paragraph. You need to go out, find out everything you can about the subject that you're writing about. You need to think, then you've done that, you need to think about it very carefully indeed, and then you need to write it up in the most readable manner possible. That's all you need to know about the methodology of history. It's a bit difficult to do.
Would either of you want to come up?
I would say that it's a market problem, and that's not the fashionable response. But British history writing has the particular attraction of, well, one has got the advantage of being a world language right now. It's our Latin. The French lost, the Germans lost, and what is it? Eurasia in the scheme of Orwell 1, meaning the U.S., Canada, and Great Britain. Even though 10 years ago, only 40% of English speakers were native. I'm sure that's a much lower percentage today. Now, so when English is has a different style from many other historiographies. The language you write in is very important. English has two parallel traditions. It has a strict, almost continental style of academic writing, and then it has a much more flexible, much more sophisticated, much more fluid, not unintellectual, but simply looser, more elegant style of writing, of which there is a very long tradition, and of which, and I did not mean this when I alluded to biography before in any disparaging way, which is an enormously powerful tool. So you have two traditions. Nothing is wrong with either of these traditions. Obviously, in one tradition, you are aiming at a few colleagues and maybe some other reader. In the other tradition, you may be going for doing a bestseller. There's nothing wrong with that. I'd love to do that. But they are sort of slightly different things.
I think I would say that methodology is about how you approach your research. And it's a different question how you then write it up. So, I mean, obviously there's a whole range of things you can do under the heading methodology, but at the very least, I think all professional historians should think very hard about what sources they're choosing, the limitations, the possibilities of those sources, the questions they can and cannot answer with those sources. They need also to think about how those questions relate to the tradition, the historiography within which they're working, because it is a professional endeavour, and we're engaged in an accumulative project of knowledge and understanding and debate. So you can do that under the heading methodology. You don't necessarily, if you don't want to, have to extend that to thinking about theoretical perspectives. Some historians like to do that and others prefer not to. But I don't think any historian, as Paul said, can escape methodological questions, and if they are trying to escape them, then really they're not doing professional history, I would say. But then how you write it up is another question. If you want to write it up as a story, then that's one way of doing it. I probably would argue it has some limitations, actually. I mean, I think you want to think analytically about the materials that you're looking at, and a story is unlikely, not impossibly, but it's unlikely, I think, to make that very effective. There's all sorts of other ways of approaching history which have nothing to do with obtuse or obscure writing. It's perfectly possible to write thematically, to write analytically, but still put it in perfectly readable prose that anybody can follow, anybody who's interested. So I would say there are two questions in your one.